Good afternoon. Today's gospel is pretty dense, so I want to really just focus on a couple of key ideas and bring those forward. First, I want to challenge John's math skills. He's a great writer, but I'm not sure math is his thing. Towards the end of the reading, you may have noticed that John makes a comment that this was now the third time that Jesus had revealed himself. Wrong. This is the fourth time he's revealed himself. On Easter morning, Mary of Magdala was the first person to see the risen Lord when he revealed himself at the tomb. John seems to discount this. It may seem trivial, but I think it's something that we need to think about as we listen to the gospel in 2016, especially this particular gospel passage, which is used by many to talk about how this church's structure was starting to build. We can never forget how important women were in Jesus' life and in his ministry, how they took on roles that were non-traditional for their time. They were leaders. Mary Magdalene was certainly a disciple, and by Paul's logic, she could actually be considered an apostle. Not one of the 12, but certainly an apostle. The women in Jesus' circle were often the ones on the front lines. They stood at the foot of the cross while the other disciples were unable or unwilling to. So as we read from the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel of John this Easter season, we need to be very careful and recognize that these readings have a particularly male-centered focus, and sometimes the achievements of women are overlooked. I was going to go down that path a little bit further, but Father Leon and the bishop have a very busy week with confirmations, and they don't have a lot of time to read mail about Deacon Peter's sermon. So I'm just going to let that sit out there and go in a different direction. I find this gospel challenging. Not challenging to interpret, it's actually pretty straightforward. I find it personally challenging, mostly because it's my name that's being used. Jesus is speaking with Peter, and I just naturally tend to substitute myself into this story. It's pretty easy to relate to because Peter's a bit, and I use this term with love, Peter's a bit of a knucklehead. Yes, I just called a pope and saint a knucklehead. When you write to the bishop, the name is Donnelly with 2 N's and 2 L's. Anyways, I can relate to Peter. He means well and his heart's in the right place, but he finds it difficult to make the hard choices. This is Peter who tells Jesus that he's going to be there right to the end, and then immediately denies him 3 times when he needs it most. This is Peter who can't stay awake for an hour when Jesus is praying on the mountain. Peter's a deeply flawed human being, and I can relate to that. And in typical Peter fashion, we see how badly he's bollocked things up in today's gospel. It seems that he's led the disciples back into the fishing trade. Really? You've got to ask yourself whether this guy listened to a single thing Jesus said. Didn't Jesus pull them away from this life? And it just seems like they're backsliding within days. Despite his flaws, Jesus loves Peter so much that he freely offers mercy and redemption. We see it today in a very special way. Simon, do you love me? Peter protests, of course I do. You know I love you. And then he does it again. Simon, do you love me? And a third time, to the point where Peter starts to get irritated. In reality, we are witnessing the redemption of Peter. Peter, the one who denied Jesus in the courtyard 3 times, is given the opportunity to affirm his love, to make it right. This is a story about Peter, but it's also for each of us. We should all be personally involved in this story, sort of like how I insert myself into this gospel reading. Jesus' mercy is available to each of us without reservation. We forget that too easily. And sometimes it doesn't take much to make us believe that we're really not worthy of God's mercy. We're not perfect, just like Peter. But also like Peter, we are always worthy of that mercy. That's what this year of mercy is supposed to be all about. Reflecting more deeply on the reality that God's mercy is always available to us. Every one of us, not just a particular subset of sinners. Also, and we can't forget this, that we are often co-participants in that gift of mercy. We need to be open to allow God's mercy to flow through us and into the world to reach others. Today's gospel story is a good place to look for an example of that. One final point on mercy. This past Friday, the Vatican released Pope Francis' concluding statement on the Synod of on the Family. This document is named The Joy of Love, and I highly recommend that all of us read it. It's a bit long, but it's very interesting. Many in the media will tell us what they think it says. Many will tell us what they wished it said. But each of us needs to read it for ourselves and discern what it really says in our own hearts. We need to take that to our prayers. It deals with suffering, real suffering that families are experiencing today. Families fractured by divorce. People isolated from the sacraments for a variety of reasons. Men and women who feel less than welcome in our church because of their sexual orientation. This is a document that approaches life from the perspective of mercy. And if we need anything in this world today, it's not more rules, it's more mercy. Especially when our own personal relationships fail to measure up to a perfect standard. We need to be reminded that everyone is worthy of God's mercy, and that we are bound to be vessels to pour that mercy out into the world. We cannot withhold the gift of mercy that was poured out freely to Peter at the Sea of Tiberias. This week I pray that God opens up all of our hearts in new ways so that we can receive and feel his gift and share it with the rest of the world.